Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Crimson Chronicles podcast. I'm Rick Morton along with my co host, Tommy Ford. Tommy, we're at episode 9. We've almost made it into
Wow.
double digits. We're running away with this thing and having a great time. And I feel like every week when we come back, I say to you, this is going to be my favorite episode. And then we
Yeah.
do another one, and I just come back and tell you it's going to be my favorite episode again. But I am absolutely thrilled for what we're going to get to do today. And so, how about if you lead us in and help us get oriented to the conversation we're going to have today?
Well, thank you, Rick. And this weekend's a huge weekend at the University of Alabama campus with the Georgia Bulldogs coming to town. And it's also, it's hard to believe, but this is the 60-year reunion of the 1964 national championship team. This team was a special team. Coach Bryant called this team his favorite team several years later. The 64 team was a squad that had a lot of injuries to deal with. They beat 8 SEC opponents on their way to a 10-0 record. They found themselves trailing 5 times in 4 crucial games, but reached back for that something extra and bounced back for victories. Charlie Thornton, the longtime sports publicist for Coach Bryant and the athletic department, wrote in the 65 media guide looking back on the season that season would be one that the players would be talking about to their grandchildren for years to come. And we are now in those years from now, and today, many years from then, we have as our guests Gaylon McCollough and Jackie Sherrill, both members of that team. Gaylon is a native of Enterprise, and he led it for the Tide in 62, 63, and 64, and was a senior center on this 1964 national championship team. He was a close confidant and personal physician to Coach Paul Bear Bryant. Gaylon is a renowned plastic surgeon in the Gulf Shores and Orange Beach area and is still practicing today. And somehow in his spare time, he has managed to write at least 17 books by my count, including 3 on Alabama football. Shoulders of Giants in 1986, The Long Shadow of Coach Paul Bear Bryant in 2008, and just last year, The Saban Process, The Bryant Promise. And Jackie Sherrill was a fullback and linebacker on the 63 team, as well as the national champion 64 and 65 teams. From Biloxi, Mississippi, Jackie had a long career in coaching and is the answer to a great Alabama football trivia question. And that is, which 3 former Alabama football players went on to be head coaches at 4 different Division I schools? Well, Jackie is one of those 3 with stints at Washington State, Pittsburgh, Texas A&M, and Mississippi State. And if anybody's wondering, the others are Steve Sloan, my old boss in the athletic department. He was head coach at Vanderbilt, Texas Tech, Ole Miss, and Duke. And, of course, Coach Paul Bear Bryant, who coached at Maryland, Kentucky, A&M, and, of course, Alabama. Hey, it's great to have you guys on today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. Look, I'm really looking forward to this, and it's always good to be on with Jackie. Jackie and I have sort of become a tandem to some extent. We've done several of these things together.
Good. Well, we are pleased and welcome you this coming weekend as honorary captains along with Joe Namath at the Georgia game for your 60-year reunion. And we'll get into that in a minute, but I just wanted to know, how did y'all get from Enterprise, Alabama, and Biloxi, Mississippi, respectively, to play for Coach Bryant?
Jalen, go ahead.
Well, I actually had committed to Georgia Tech, and I was going to go to Georgia Tech and become an architect because I grew up in a construction business, meaning my dad was a plumber, and the shovel and I were real good friends, I can tell you, during that period of time. But I was going to become an architect, and I had committed. And then Coach Bryant came along, came to our house one night, and I told him, I said, Coach, I've already committed to Georgia Tech. And in his usual manner, he didn't speak right away. He just kind of dropped his head for a second, and then he nodded his head, and he said, you know, that's not a bad idea. You win a lot of ball games. You'll get a good education. But he reached over on his finger and he pulled off a ring and he handed it to me. And he said, but if you ever want one of those that says national champions, you come to Alabama and I guarantee you'll have one. So I had just played on a high school championship team. So I had a bit of a taste of that championship stuff. And so I changed my mind. And I went to Alabama, and Alabama didn't have an architectural school. So I went into medicine as a second choice. And so here we are.
Wow.
Well, at that time, Alabama was has won or was winning the national championship in '61. They came to Biloxi and trained in Biloxi before they went to the Sugar Bowl. So Coach Bryant came down, and I had a high school teammate, Lynn Patterson, that he came down and recruited both. But he was the only coach that didn't say things different, and he never asked me to come. I don't know if he asked Gaylon to come, but he never asked me to come to Alabama. He just talked about the players, talked about Alabama, and so it was different than the other coaches that came and visit. And I just said, I'm going to go to Alabama after the visit. So kind of like Gaylon and all of them, Coach Bryant had a way to saying things that you didn't want to disappoint.
Well, Gaylon, you were ineligible to play freshman in 1961. Although you couldn't play, what was it like to be around those guys who were on Coach Bryant's first national championship squad? What did you learn from them?
Well, in the dormitory, I paid close attention to the upperclassmen. And I noticed that group was all business. There was not very much horseplay or anything going on in the dormitory. They were all about business, and they were very well disciplined. And of course, in those days, the freshmen scrimmaged the varsity. And so we had quite a bit of interaction with that championship team, I can tell you right now. And they were tough. They were tough, as Coach Bryant would say, as ladder knots. And it was really, I think it was great to be around them and to watch their season. And they won some very close games, but they were very well disciplined, and they knew what they were there for, because we all went there to win a championship, because that's what he promised us. And it's, if you do what I ask you to do, you'll come away with a championship ring. So I really learned a lot from those upperclassmen. And, a few of those 61 team starters came over and played in the 62 team too. Leroy Jordan, Bill Battle, mention a couple. And those were great leaders on that 62 team.
Yeah, Sharp and Pell.
Jimmy Sharp, that's right.
That team, Gaylon, was probably much more talented than we were.
Yeah. Well, Joe was probably the greatest athlete we had on our team, and the rest of us are just sort of journeymen. We were there primarily to support him. When he got hurt, that was a whole different mindset that came through that team.
What a career y'all had. I did a little calculations here, and Gaylon, counting your being there as a freshman, Alabama was 40 wins and 4 losses in your 4 years. And Jackie, for you, Alabama was 38-5-1 in your 4 years. And we'll zero in on the 64 team in just a minute. But in general, what was it like to play for Coach Bryant? What did you learn playing for him? What was tougher, the physical side or the mental side? And what lessons did he teach you today that you're still using today?
Well, Jackie, you go first on this one.
The word quit was not in his vocabulary. I don't know, Gaylon, how many came in with you, but there were 67 freshmen when we came in, and that's counting the walk-on. Back then, you could have 90 in 2 years. You could have 40, 50, or 45, 45 in 2 years span. So the class that came in 62, I think we had 50 scholarship, but we also had walk-ons. But out of that class, there was 7 of us that were seniors and 4 redshirts. And Coach Stallings always talks about the junction. And I said, Coach, you were part of it at Alabama that chased a lot of us off too. There wasn't any question when you lined up, you were not going to quit until the final whistle. I always said this about Coach Bryant. He could take an average player and make him better. He could take a good player and make him outstanding, but he could take an outstanding player and make him great just by him being around him. there were a lot of us that were not great players, but we didn't have Namath's talent. But he made us a lot better than what we really were.
Yeah, I think back a lot on playing for him, and I can tell you it wasn't fun. If anybody tells you it was fun, they're not telling you the truth. And mentally and physically, I don't know if I could say which was the toughest, because he was in your head all the time, and
Yeah.
you knew you wanted to please him more than anything else. But one of the best sounds in the world, if you pleaded for him to say, "Atta boy, way to go," and it was
Yeah.
not very often that he said those things. He just was not one to give out a lot of accolades, and he demanded a lot of us. We knew we were in the presence of greatness. I just didn't realize how great it was.
I will say this today, everybody talks about Nick Saban, and Nick, without a doubt, is a great, but I can say this very honestly, he was not Coach Bryant. The difference is Nick had a lot of help. Coach Bryant did it all by himself.
Well, the book that I wrote, I don't want to ever use the word comparing them, but I showed the similarities between the two coaches. And what I really did once I started studying Nick's process is that you realize that really what he did, he repackaged almost everything that Coach Bryant taught. It's the same thing. And in the book I wrote, The Long Shadow of Coach Paul Bear Bryant, I wrote that Nick's first year at Alabama. And in the very last chapter, he was 7-6 that year. And I wrote in the last chapter that Coach Saban will be the next legend at Alabama. And the reason I said that is because he was reintroducing the things that Coach Bryant used to be successful. So, I mean, it's different names, different terminology and that sort of thing, but the same toughness, focused on the little things. I mean, Coach Bryant used to say, take care of the little things and the big things will take care of themselves. And in those days, just as an aside to tell you something a little bit humorous, in those days, if we won the national championship, your hometown, if you were on that team, your hometown would have a day for you, parade, and then some kids got cars.
Cars, right?
Yeah, after the season now. So, and after the eligibility. But he came down to Enterprise, and he was talking to my hometown and all of my family and friends there. And he started talking about me, and he said, Gaylon really wasn't all that talented, but he just didn't know he was. So he played above his head. And I thought, well, Coach, that's about the best backhanded compliment I ever got.
Yeah.
And I think what Jackie was saying, that's what he could do. He could motivate you to believe in yourself, and you generally played at a higher level than you thought you could. Now, but he pushed us in the off season and in the pregame and spring training. He pushed us to the hilt so that we would know how far we could go.
Well, one thing that he always said, which I used many years in coaching, that talking about the off-season fall camp, that every football team starts out even, except the teams that are better prepared physically and mentally, they start here. And every team mid-season wears down, but that means that you're that much better than the rest of them because you mentally prepared and physically prepared. And that's his mindset, that you were going to be better prepared mentally, but you were going to be better prepared physically as well.
And one of the things too, Jackie, to underscore that, you mentioned that we came from behind so many times that year to win the game. And he used to focus on the fourth quarter. And we were in better physical condition than all of our opponents put together. He saw to that. And that's why we were able to come from behind in the fourth quarter to win so many of the games that we won. As a matter of fact, that 64 team, we were labeled the cardiac kids because we did win so many games in the last minute or so. And you mentioned the 40 wins and I think 4 losses, but we never lost a single game by more than 4 points. And so we honestly believed that there was still one snap on the clock and we had the football we were going to win the ball game. And that wasn't just hollow talk. We honestly believed it in our heart. And I think that had a lot to do with our being able to win the championship.
I'm just curious. As I've heard both of you talk, and this is now the third interview that we've done with you men that have played for Coach Bryant. Coach Bryant built men. He didn't just build football players. And I look at both of you. I look at your lives. I look at your careers, and they're indicative of the things that you learned in that experience and what he invested in you. What have you been able to turn around and invest in other men as a result of what he poured into you?
Well, the thing that I will say that even Coach Bryant was very, very tough on us. I mean, we always joke when Coach Bryant would walk out of the locker room, and he usually went out 5 to 10 minutes early. But if he was humming, "We shall gather at the river," you didn't want to go because you knew it wasn't going to be nice. But one thing that Coach Bryant did that a lot of people in Gaylon knows very well, he took care of his players. Now, that didn't mean he didn't discipline them. He had two of the best players he ever had, Namath and Stabler. He disciplined, but he took care of the players. And I will say that about Nick. What impresses me about Nick is that he took care of his players too.
Yeah.
Coach Bryant gave us more than football. And that's why if you look at the success rate of all the former players, and I'm talking about at A&M or Kentucky or Maryland, they all probably are very, very successful.
Well, Jackie has coached so many players in his profession, and he's had an opportunity to have that kind of impact on hundreds, if not thousands, of young men. My experience, I've trained 100 facial plastic surgeons, which is more than anybody in the country. I took everything that I learned from Coach Bryant, and I incorporated that into the way that I run my business, run my practice, in terms of recruiting people to work for me or with me, managing, disciplining them, setting standards, making sure that everybody knows what they're supposed to do. And then the other thing is being consistent. And he was very consistent. As Jackie said, it didn't matter if you were the greatest player on the team. If you didn't follow the rules right to the letter, you were disciplined, and you were off the team for a while. And I'll just share one other thing with you. I think some of the little aside stories may be helpful to answer that question. I remember one night, early one morning, Gary White comes around at 5 o'clock, waking everybody up in the dormitory. Get up. Coach Bryant's got a meeting at 6 o'clock for us. So we were scared to death. We didn't know what was going to happen. So we go over there, and he gets up and he said, I've been up all night thinking. And before we started our day, I just had to share with you some of the things that I've been thinking about. He never mentioned football for the entire hour. He said, I guarantee you some of you are going to go to work one day, and when you get there, you're going to be handed your pink slip and you're going to lose your job. He said, then you're going to go home and you might find your wife with somebody that wasn't supposed to be there. And he said, you think your world's going to fall apart? And he said, you got two choices. You can crawl into a hole, or you can get your butt up and go to work and do something else. He said, I don't ever want to hear any one of you guys talk about not having a job. He said, because what you do is you find somebody with a lawnmower. And he said, you go into business with them. You say, let me borrow your lawnmower and I'll split what I make with you. If you go to the house, knock on the door, say your grass needs cutting, I'm going to cut your grass. If you like what I've done, if you don't like what I've done, you don't owe me anything. And so he was teaching us about life, not about X's and O's and football necessarily. And those are the lessons that you take with you for the rest of your life.
One thing I've heard that, talking about practice, that y'all look forward to Saturdays and the games because it was the easiest day of the week. Is that right?
Hey, it was the only day during the week we got anything to drink. Nowadays they hydrate them. Hell, we'd go out there and we were practicing for 3 hours in 90-degree weather.
No water.
Get a sip of water.
Hey, we
I
didn't start
remember that
Galen until
we didn't
you.
have any body fat, but I remember we'd come in and weigh ourselves, and we were 10 pounds lighter than we were when we went out there that day.
Galen, we didn't start water until your senior year, my junior year. That's when they started the
And I
water.
think we got a little squirt of salt water about every hour.
Down your salt tablets. But we go play Georgia, and Galen, you remember? Anyway, we go play Georgia, and we had some young players that ran to the Coke machine as soon as we got to the hotel. So
To the dressing room.
yeah, and so as soon as make a long story short, it didn't make Coach Bryant very happy, but his TV show, and he held up a bottle of Coke, and he called it belly wash. So, our off limits was Coke. We couldn't have any Cokes.
Well, we could have them. We could have them most of the time at halftime, but we didn't get anything to drink at all until our senior year, where they found out that we might need a little bit of salt in our system. But it was grueling. He put you to the test. So you're right. The games were the easiest part of the week for us.
Yeah.
And
I'm sure Coach Goosetree loved giving y'all a little salt water, didn't
he didn't want to do it.
he? Yeah, that's what I mean. I was around Coach a long time, and I cannot imagine how he was as a trainer. So
I don't know about Jackie, but I was never hurt. In his mind, I never had an injury. It didn't matter what it was. Just, shake it off.
and it didn't matter what the injury was. It was put a little ice on it or get in the ice tub, and that's about it.
His famous words, when anybody walked in the locker room, he says, "What's up?" Meaning, what the hell are you doing in here?
Yeah. Looking specifically at the 64 national championship season, which will honor this week a 60-year reunion of this team. The 1964 media guide, which was published before the first game was ever played, described y'all as, quote, green, but with potential, unquote. In a very broad question, what do y'all remember most about this 64 season?
Well, we had some great players. We had Namath, and Galen is underselling himself. Galen was a very good player. But we had some players, Hudson Harris. We had players that could play. But we also had a class that was really talented. Steve Bowman, Steve Sloan. You can go on down the line. So the mixture of the two, and certainly the leadership of the upperclassmen, that group, mixture-wise, I think Coach Bryant knew that he had talent. Which Steve Bowman, go through the others on there. Les Kelly was one of the fullbacks, but he knew that he had some talent. But I don't know if he knew when we first started that it would come together so quickly and stay together like that. There was no question. He probably liked his 64 team awful lot. There's one thing about Coach Bryant, and Galen knew him extremely well later in life. Things that were really important to him, he lets you know. And, there's two things. The Junction Boys was important to him because what happened there, but also the 64 team was very important to Coach Bryant.
Well, we didn't have very many seniors on that 64 team that were starters. No. I was just sitting here a moment ago counting them on my fingers, and I think of the 22 players, there were only 6 or 7 seniors on that team. And Jackie's year, he was a year behind us. He mentioned himself and Steve Bowman and Steve Sloan, to mention a few. But we would not have won the 64 championship team without Steve Sloan. Joe Namath was injured about mid-season, and he was not 100% the rest of the year. In most games, Steve Sloan played more than Joe did in the second half of the season. I think Steve Sloan was probably the most underrated quarterback that ever played at Alabama. I don't think he ever got the credit for what he truly contributed to that.
Yeah, I love Steve, and he hired me in athletics, and I'll owe him that gratitude forever and ever. Remember seeing this photo of Joe Namath laid out on the field against North Carolina State, and Coach Bryant's walking away, and Coach Goostree's down there attending to him, and it's amazing that he wasn't hurt more than he was, and the fact that he came back and tried to play that year all the way up to the bowl game was a testimony to Joe and to the training staff.
Well, I will never forget when he went down. And, the offensive line, we got together and we kind of huddled among ourselves when we saw that he was injured. And we said, okay, guys, it's on us from here on. Because honestly, I hope you take this the right way, we felt as long as Joe was in the game, all we had to do was protect him, and he was going to win the game for us if we just kept the other guys off it. But then when Joe went down, we realized that everything changed. And from that point forward, we had to pick it up, and it was on us. We were behind 2 or 3 times in the Florida game. And we basically went to the coaching staff and said, let's run the ball, put it on us. And we took great pride in that. I can tell you that offensive line we had that year, we were not all that big, but we were quick and we were gutty.
Well, the statistics out on the running game as far as rushing, Alabama against the opponents all that rushed for some even today, you'd like to have the rushing yardage that the 64 team had.
The Georgia Tech game, the Chick Graining, Darwin Holt incident had happened 3 years earlier in 1961. And I wanted to ask y'all this. In 62, following the 7-6 loss to Tech, in anger over the incident from the previous year, the Georgia Tech fans threw whiskey bottles at Coach Bryant as he was exiting the field. And then 2 years after that, in 64, back in Atlanta at Grant Field, during Alabama's pregame walkthrough, Coach Bryant wore a helmet. And do y'all recall this? And was it a ploy, or was he being serious, or would just kind of be humorous to the Tech fans?
No, it wasn't any humor into that. I can tell you that not only did they throw whiskey bottles when he was walking off the field on the sidelines, they were throwing stuff at us on the sidelines. The bench was real close to the stands. And they were screaming and throwing stuff the whole game. It was just terrible. And I remember when he started to get off the bus, he turned to the trainer and he said, get me a size 7.5. I don't know what size it was, but he said, Coach, I don't know that we have any helmets that big. And I remember Lewis Thompson, I'll never forget his name. Yeah. He stuck his hand up and he said, I got a 7.5 helmet. So they gave that to Coach Bryant. We walked out there and he was in his suit. We were all walking around before the game and he's wearing his helmet. He was making a statement to the press more than anything else with that. But we didn't have any whiskey bottles thrown at us that day.
He was really good at that, wasn't he? Being able to send a statement at the right time.
The man knew how to say it and what to say. And I'll tell you how I learned about that. Several years later, Jackie mentioned, I got to know Coach Bryant from a totally different standpoint. But I went to visit him one night before a game. We were going to play Baylor in Birmingham. And I had a coin that I had promised him that I would give because he came and spoke to the Birmingham Touchdown Club. And that's another story. He never wanted money because he had to report the money. He wanted a $20 gold piece. And, a $20 gold piece in those days was just about what an SEC coach got for going to talk. So somehow the guy that was supposed to get his $20 gold piece that night didn't do it. And I told him, I said, Coach, I'll get that for you next week. And he said, yeah, I'll be in Baylor. We're playing Baylor and I'll be in Birmingham. So he said, just drop it by the hotel. So I go by the Holiday Inn in Bessemer and I knock on the door. And he comes to the door, and I said, Coach, here's your gold piece. I don't want to bother you. He said, no, come on in. He said, I need a break. And so I walked in, and he was in a suite, and he had taken the desk and pulled it in the center of the room. And we walked by the desk, and I noticed 3 legal pads sitting on the desk. And I looked at him and went over and sat down. We talked for a little while. I said, Coach, I can't stand it. I got to ask you, why are the 3 illegal bets? He said, hell, I ain't never told anybody this before. He said, that first one's what I'm going to say if we get beat. The middle is what I'm going to say if we tie. And the other one's what I'll say if we win. And so I'm thinking to myself, all these years, I thought it was just spontaneous. I thought it just came out at the right moment. No, Jackie would understand this. He always said rehearse. You didn't practice something, you rehearsed it. So he had everything down that he was going to say, regardless of what the circumstances were. And I learned that night. It was a great lesson.
Well, I got the coach for him as a GA. And what people don't understand, Coach Bryant filled out every practice schedule. And when the coaches came in for the meeting, he would give them the 2-hour practice, 5 minutes doing this, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. But he gave the whole practice, and he would do the whole practice every morning before the staff meeting. And of course, the coaches coached, but he set it up. This is what we're going to do at this time.
There's a story about that Georgia Tech 7-6 loss that is in my mind today. And I think it may be worth telling because it was a great lesson. We lost the game and we scored late in the game. We went for 2. They didn't give it to us. We made it, but they didn't give it to us. And then we came back down. Leroy caused a fumble. Less than a minute to go in the game. We marched down to the 16-yard line. And on 3rd down, called a timeout. And he was trying to decide whether to go ahead and kick the field goal on 3rd down or wait till 4th down. And they had a meeting with the staff, and they decided that we'd go ahead and try one more play. And long story short, Bill Battle jumped as high as I've ever seen anybody trying to. The quarterback was Jack Herbert. Namath was out of the game by halftime. He got hit in the ribs and didn't play the second half of the game. And so Jack Herbert was trying to throw the ball out of bounds, and Bill Battle jumped so high he got a hand on it, and it fell right into the hands of the Tech guy, and the game was over. So we go into the dressing room, and we're sitting in there, and we were ranked number 1 in the country going into that game. And that was the 8th, that was the 8th or 9th game. I think it was the 9th game because we came back and beat Auburn the next week. But we went into the dressing room and we were in there and everybody had our face in our hands and we were just dejected. And he walked into the dressing room and he had been to the Tech dressing room to congratulate them, by the way. He was a little late. So he came in and he said, take a knee. And that day or that night, rather than saying the Lord's Prayer, he led us in prayer. There was this, dear God, forgive me, or let these men, dear God, let these young men forgive me. If I'd stayed at home, they'd have won this game. And all of a sudden, I mean, I get goosebumps when I tell you that, y'all, because we're living that. And all of a sudden, the atmosphere in that room went from, what did he just say? And then he stood up. And he said, I've never been more proud of a group of young men. He said, y'all didn't get beat out there today. He said, time just ran out on you. That was the first time that I ever heard that. And he said, we play Auburn next week in Birmingham. Yeah, you can feel sorry for yourself and we'll go out there and we'll get beat again. But if you pick up where you left off in the last 3 minutes of this game today, we'll be all right. We beat Auburn 33-3, I think, the next week. The man knew what to say at the right time, and he knew how to get into your head and into your heart and make you do things that you didn't think you could.
Well, the level of accountability in that what he was teaching to you guys is that in taking responsibility himself, and that I'm sure knowing that's had to pay dividends for you in later life in understanding like how to live.
One of his favorite sayings, if we won, y'all did it. If we tie, we did it. If we lose, I did it. How many times did you hear him say that, Jackie?
But he really felt that. He was more prepared to play. And like Galen said, that game, we're playing Tennessee and we tied Tennessee. This is a year later. And Staber came into the game and after Sloan and took us to the 4-yard line. And David Ray's the kicker. I'm the up back. He sends us in the game to kick a field goal to win the game. And we had a coach running down the sideline hollering, clock play, clock play. So Stabig takes the ball, throws it out of bounds, but it was fourth down, as we know. After the game, what he did was the Legion Field, he had the fence and then the stadium, and it wasn't any wider than maybe 5 feet. So we're all crowded, and Hoodow Hicks was the manager, and he left the keys on the field and said, Coach, I'm sorry, I left the keys on the field. But Coach Bryant makes his way to the door, and he rears back and hits it one time, and then to test it, then he kicked the whole door off the hinges. And so we came in there, and the coaches were coming in after we came in, and he looked at the coaches and he said, get out of here. So the coaches went back out, and he said to us, I can honestly say this is the first game that we, meaning us, the coaches, lost the game. I apologize. Turned around, walked out, got in the highway patrol car and took off. But he took responsibility. If we lost, he didn't do the job that he was supposed to do to help win the game.
Looking ahead that season, too, we beat Auburn 21-14 on Thanksgiving Day, and that's when Ray Ogden had his 108-yard second half kickoff return. He finished the season 10-0, and back then the AP and UPI selected national champions following the regular season and before the bowl games. So, as you know, we lost to Texas 21-17 in the Orange Bowl. It was the first bowl game to be televised in prime time and in quote-unquote living color. And this was a game that's still talked about today, so almost 60 years later. And Texas had a great team. But, Gaylon, just one question. Did Joe Namath score on that play?
It was in the end zone, 2.5 feet. It was a quarterback sneak, and just as a little bit of an aside, we used to get RBIs if you did something outstanding, if you scored a touchdown, recovered a fumble, intercepted a pass. But the only way linemen could get an RBI is if you blocked your man into the end zone when they scored. So we were all very, very conscious of where we were compared to the goal line at the end of the play. So it was fourth down, and it was 6 inches. And so when the play was over, I started looking for Joe, and he was right on top of me. And the ball was in the end zone a good 2 feet. One official comes running in, takes it away from him, raises his hand, calls it a touchdown. The other line judge comes running from the side, and he said, I couldn't tell. Did he score? I couldn't tell for the pileup. And the official said, yeah, he was in the end zone. I took the ball away from him. I'm this close to this conversation now. And then the guy with the white cap, who was a Southwest Conference official, came running in and grabbed the ball away from the first official and put it down on the 1 foot line and whistled first down Texas, overruled the play. We didn't have instant replay in those days. So the game was over. And then once again, the lesson of a lifetime. We left the field. It was the last play. That was the last play of the game. And we walked to the sidelines. The longest trip I ever took in my life was to the sidelines that night. It was the last play I ever played for the University of Alabama. And as we walked off the field, one of the players behind me said, Coach, we scored. And with that, all of us turned and looked at him. And he took a little step back to get our attention. He said, if he'd have walked in, there'd been no question about it, would there? Boom. What did he do? He turned it right back around. The lesson of a lifetime is this. If you want to accomplish something in life, you can't do just enough to get the job done. You got to go above and beyond and leave no room for doubt. And that haunts me. That play haunts me every day of my life, that we didn't do enough so that there was no question about it. And just as an aside, a friend of mine ran into Tommy Nobis, who was the Texas linebacker, right there in the middle of that night. He ran into him in the Atlanta airport. Tommy played for the Atlanta Falcons. And he asked him, he said, Tommy, got to ask you a question. Did Alabama score? And Nova said, yep, they scored. So he openly admitted it. So no question about it. But the record books will never reflect all that.
Wow. Well, as you know, the next day, Joe went on to sign an unheard of contract with the New York Jets and became perhaps the most iconic player in professional football history. Well, tell me about Joe's being a teammate. Tell me about Joe Namath and how he was
Jackie, you
as a
start.
friend.
Well, of all the players I played with or coached, he was the best athlete, period.
Mm.
If you wanted to play basketball, if you wanted to play baseball, or whatever you wanted to do, he could beat you. But there's one thing that sticks in my mind of being on the field. They would tie a tire from the goalpost, swing the tire back and forth, and at 35 yards, he could throw the ball through the tire.
Wow.
Yeah. No, Namath, if he had not gotten hurt, he would have really been something in pro ball. Well, he still was, but I'm talking about he could run. I think he ran a 4.5.
I know this. He was the greatest athlete that I'd ever seen at that time. We used to play basketball in the off season, and Joe was about 6'2". He could dunk the basketball behind his head.
Mm.
He had the vertical leap was just unbelievable, and he could run like a gazelle. Coach Bryant put in the sprint out pass for him because he was such a great runner. And on one of our spring games, I ended up playing on the other side. I was a linebacker in those days, and I played against him. And I can tell you, when he's coming at you, you just never know what he's going to do, whether he's going to jump over you this side or that side. And then the real tragedy is that most of the world never got to see Joe at his best. Even injured, he was all everything. But had he not been injured, there's no telling what he would have done.
When you talk about the Orange Bowl, he only played the second half.
Second half.
He was the MVP of the game.
Yeah. We were behind, and we went in at halftime, and Coach Bryant often did this. He threw the game plan out at halftime. If it wasn't working, we put in 4 running plays and 3 or 4 pass patterns, and that was our offense the second half. And he said, we're going to start with Namath. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to throw the ball on first and second down. We're going to run it on third down because Texas had scouted us. By the time I snapped the ball, the Texas linemen were across the line of scrimmage coming at us because we were going on first sound thinking that we were going to get quick, but they'd already figured out what our snap count was. But so it was an amazing comeback with him in the game. And like Jackie said, he ended up being the MVP. And you mentioned the contract. Tommy, I've got a little insight on that I'd like to share with you. And Jackie talked about him being good at everything. And he and I were talking one night. He roomed right across the hall from me. And we were talking one night about shooting pool. And I said, oh, you can shoot pool, huh? And he said, yeah, a little bit. And I said, well, we ought to go play some pool. So we started going down after dinner to the Shamrock, which was in the basement of a building downtown. And we'd walk in there. The guy that owned it would clear a table because it was Namath, of course. And so we would sit there, we'd shoot pool for an hour or so. And I think I beat him like 1 out of every 100 games. And I was a pretty good pool shooter. But on the way down there, this is another part of the story, that he had been, of course, he was drafted by the St. Louis Cardinals and the NFL and the Jets in the AFL. I'd been drafted by the Cowboys. So one night we were on the way down there, and I said, Joe, I hate to ask you this, but I said, I just got off the phone with Gil Brandt with the Cowboys, and they want to know what kind of salary I'd be looking at if I were to go play with them. And I said, do you mind telling me what y'all are talking about? He said, I just got off the phone with Mike Bike, Galen, and he said the offer was $100,000 tonight. I said, what? I said, Joe, you've got to be kidding me. I said, nobody knows what a great player you are any better than I do, but there ain't nobody worth $100,000. And he said, well, my guy tells me we're just getting started. So every night we would go down to shoot pool, and I'd say, okay, what's it up to today? And so it kept going up 50,000, this. And then finally, as it turned out, this is a part of the story that very few people know. The Cardinals offered him more money than the Jets did. It was $427,000 or $437,000 they offered him, and the Jets offered him $400,000. And I said, well, which one are you going to take? He said, I'm going with the Jets. And I said, why did you make that decision? And he said, well, I'm trying to think of his name. Sonny Werblin.
Sonny Werblin.
Sonny, he said, Joe, you go play with the Cardinals and you'll have a great career and you'll be all pro. He said, you come play with me and I'll make you a household item. You'll make more money for the rest of your life off the field than you'll ever make on the field. And so the rest is history.
Wow. Yeah.
A green Lincoln Continental, 4-door, same color as the Jets.
Well, we love Mike Byte. He's 95 years old now, and we're going to get him on our podcast sometime soon.
He's got some stories.
What a guy. He sure does. So, well, guys, this has been awesome. This weekend, you and your teammates will be honored at the Georgia game on your 60-year anniversary of the 64 National Championship team. What does that mean for y'all 60 years later?
Go, Jack.
Well, the biggest thing is, like Gaylon said, and held up that ring. There's only one team that wears that ring for the rest of their life. And so, we as players didn't know what that meant. But when you talk about a national championship team, everybody remembers that team. And certainly the 64, because starting out the season, Gaylon, we were not in the top 10, I don't think.
I don't think so.
But winning the championship and how it was done, because we had a lot of injuries that year.
Yeah.
And so the guys that was able to keep it together, and Gaylon talked about Steve Sloan and some other players that stepped up and played really well. But no, the 64 team is a very special team to the people that are old enough to understand Alabama football.
Well, I've written, actually, Tommy, 25 books now.
Excuse me.
In doing my research for the books, I came across a saying by Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book about the Holocaust. And I don't know if I can quote it exactly, but he said, people who suffer together, bind together, and become one. I think back at what we went through in the upper gym and in spring training, and he put us through gut checks. The gut check was that you kept going until somebody quit. And then if somebody quit, then that was good enough. We would end it. But we went through a lot together. We suffered together, and we loved each other, and we played together. And I think that was the reason why we were able to win some of those games that we should have won. To go back, and unfortunately, so many of our players are gone. They're not with us anymore, and the others are sick and not able to come. But to be able to go back and to see those guys and be with them again, and to be on Saban Field and Bryant-Denny Stadium now, to be there and remember the times that we were there is very, very special. I can tell you that much. And anybody who loves Alabama football, you should know that if you're a fan, we all greatly appreciate the things that you did and inspiring us, cheering for us, and helping us along, because we couldn't have done it without all of that support coming from the university itself and from the fan base everywhere.
Gaylon, that goes both ways. I think for those of us that are fans of the University of Alabama, that have grown up just loving everything about the university and about the Crimson Tide, there's nothing like the 64 team. I hope you guys have an incredible reunion. I hope it is full of joy and memories and all that it should be. But I want to say thank you on behalf of the fan. Thank you for the memories. Thank you for what you guys have done, and ultimately for the inspiration that this 64 team is for those of us that love the Crimson Tide. And thanks for joining us on the Crimson Chronicles podcast. We get to have and host and be a part of some of the most amazing conversations in the world. And so we thank you guys for pulling back the curtain and giving us an opportunity to hear a little bit about some of the incredible experiences that you've been able to live.
Yeah, thank y'all so much.
Thank you. And like I said, Tommy, that y'all have done a great job on your podcast because I watch all of it.
Well,
Thank you. And so, Jackie, you're going to know that we're going to end it the same way we end every one, which is let's give them all a roll tide.
Yeah.
Yeah, roll tide.
Roll tide.